God, thank you for giving us this day. Thank you for giving us this opportunity. And what I said a moment ago was partially, it was said in jest, but it's unfortunately true. And that is, as people, we find it so difficult to be satisfied. And if the sun's out, we complain about how dry it is. If it's rainy, we complain that there's no sun. And it speaks to human nature. But I pray, Lord, that you use times like this and the whole process of discipleship and chipping away and molding us and shaping us so that ultimately our satisfaction is in you and that we're able to say with a straight face, as Paul communicated, that we have learned in every circumstance to be content. So I pray, God, as we open up your word today, and we're looking at a passage and starting a section that is altogether not easy, that you'll help us to understand what we need to understand and to realize the limits of what we need to know, but also to pay attention to what you've said. So we ask for your help in this time. In Christ's name, amen. All right, so we're going to be in Daniel chapter 7. And let's see, I have been pastoring the better part now of 20 years, and I have taught through repeatedly in various ways the first 6 chapters of Daniel. And so it's taken me 20 years to finally do this, but we're going to start, because it's not fun, the second half of Daniel. Because you start wading through some very difficult stuff. But as we do that, let me ask you this. If you had to give a word to describe the category that you might put the book of Daniel in, you may say that Daniel is a book of, how would you fill in the blank? You'd say it's a book of prophecy. So if we're talking about a prophecy, what is a prophecy? Yeah, so it's saying something. Well, she said you're telling the future. So you're speaking about that which has not happened, which is going to happen. How far in the future is a prophecy? It could be up close. It could be really far away. And in the Bible, we see stacks of prophecies that were given. Sometimes they were short-term, something that was getting ready to happen in a very brief period of time. Sometimes it was a period of months or years, and by the time we get to the book of Daniel, we're starting to think about prophecy and stuff, and some of it was going to happen at the time, but it's also thinking about long-term, like end-of-time stuff. All right, so when we start talking about prophecy, we're talking about, and from a biblical perspective, when we're talking about biblical prophecy, we're talking about how it is when God is pulling back the curtain and giving us some insight as to what is going to happen in the future. Now, as God does this, how would you describe the manner in which he does it? That he uses a whole lot of what? All right, so there's visions, and many of those visions contain what? Because, in fact, what we're getting ready to see with Daniel is a series of visions, and with John, in the book of Revelation, what did he had a vision. All right, so in those visions, what did they get a lot of? Did they get a lot of symbols? Right? And they're communicated to us as symbols. And how does a symbol work? How does a symbol work? It's not necessarily a one-to-one corollary, is it? It's given you a sense of. It's not giving you necessarily all the detail. And sometimes it's almost like a placeholder, but it's given you a sense that it's kind of like this. It's kind of like this. And so a difference from speaking in symbols, instead of talking in symbolic or metaphorical language, what's another way that I could speak to you? Instead of just talking to you in symbols and word pictures, I could talk to you how? I could talk to you very plainly and just say, this is how it is. this, and with respect to the future, I could say this is going to happen, and so Shelby is going to take you all to lunch today, and she is going to buy you what you want, except you have to drink water. Drinks are on you. So you have to, everything except water. Shelby's going to buy your lunch. So that's speaking very directly. If I wanted to speak metaphorically, if I want to use a symbol, I might say, what would be our symbol for Shelby? How about an angel? Thank you for not saying goat, right? That wouldn't be good. And so an angel descends, and instead of lunch, what might be the symbol for lunch? Or an angel has handfuls of bread. Right, and so that could be the symbol that Shelby is providing you lunch today. So if I'm talking metaphorically, I may say like that. If I want to speak very clearly, if I want to make sure that you know with exacting detail, I would say at 11:15, Shelby is going to pay for your lunch at Trip. So be there at 11:15, okay? And you got that. Write that in your Bible. Shelby, lunch, angel. Anyway, so... So which manner did God communicate to us with respect to the future? Clearly or symbolically? He used this. He used this. And I think there's some reasons for that. So why? Well, Why the symbolism? I think from my perspective, there's at least two really big reasons for this. What might you say? Why use word pictures, metaphors, and symbols as opposed to just speaking clearly? Yeah, so if you're using sometimes in some of these visions, you would use symbols because there's a inability to adequately communicate. So, for example, if Daniel had to, for example, describe a helicopter, how would Daniel have described a helicopter? I mean, think of how difficult that would be. It would, if you're Daniel and it's 400 BC, how are you going to describe a helicopter? What would you say? It was kind of like a giant bird that had like spinning wings, but roared like a dragon, right? So sometimes you would use symbols because there's just no adequate way to communicate this, and especially to communicate it generationally. So what we might understand very clearly now, because we've got something to compare it to, we've got a category to put that in. 2,500 years ago, that didn't exist. And so part of the reason was because of the inability to adequately over time communicate what is going to happen. But there's another reason that God, I think, used symbols as opposed to speaking very, very clearly. Did you ever talk in, those of you as parents, if you and your spouse are having an adult conversation with the children in the room, sometimes you might talk in some lofty, symbolic phrasing or language, and the kids may get some of it, but why don't you say it very clearly? All of that is not meant for them. You want to control and manage what exactly it is that they know. Put another way, you might do this because there is that God did this because you need to know only what you need to know. Is there any reason that God needed for me and for you to give you an exacting blueprint of every detail with all right, at 9:15 and 13 seconds on this particular date, this is going to happen? Is there any reason that I needed to know all that? No, there's not. No, there's not. There are some things that I need to know, aren't there? What do I need to know? In fact, think about that. With respect to prophecy and what's going to happen, big picture, what's the stuff that I need to know? Hold that just a second. Let me. All right, the stuff I need to know. Somebody said something? I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think how I want to best phrase that. And if you couldn't hear, she said we're going to live forever. I want to hold that one over here. It's not that's not true. With respect to prophecy and what is going to happen, what are some very basic things I need to know? In fact, perhaps foremost, what do I need to know? What'd you say? Why do you need to be ready? What's going to happen? Well, in fact, give it a little more. Thank you. You said Christ is coming back. So Jesus is coming back. That I know clearly. Why do I know that clearly? He told us that very clearly, didn't he? He didn't use that. He didn't say that symbolically, did he? He said that very clearly. So I know that Jesus is coming back. And with respect to that, what do I know about the timing? So the timing is unknown to me and will remain that way. I'll never know that. And so how much use or benefit is there in me in trying to figure out the exact time of that? No, because the Bible says that no man knows the day or the hour. So if I'm God and stupid Michael happens to guess the time, you know what I would do? Move it. Nope. Anyway, the exact timing of this is unknown to me, but what is known and the Bible's very clear about is that Jesus is coming back. I know that. And before Jesus comes back, what do I know? And think just really broad terms. Before Jesus comes back, what's going to happen? Thank you. In fact, she said lots of bad stuff. It's going to get bad. That's a very theological statement, isn't it? Well, about that, even there, all right, so hold that for a second. All right. I know that Jesus is coming back, and I know before Jesus comes back, it's going to get bad. It's going to get really bad. But after he comes back, with respect to this, I know that eventually everything sin made wrong, he makes right. I just summarized for you the progressive flow of prophecy and what's going to happen. It's going to get really bad. Jesus is going to come back, and eventually he's going to make right everything that sin made wrong. In fact, what you have in the opening chapters of Genesis is that paradise is lost. What do you get at the end? Paradise is restored. And so the original intentional plan of God finally and eternally gets realized. Now, every one of these I believe to be an essential. And not just essential, but these are foundational. So everything that we add to this is a detail. And the Bible does it give us more details than this? Yes, it does give us more details than this. And about those details, what are many of them like? We talked about it just a moment ago. Many of them are symbolic. Now, when you are taking a symbol that is given, for example, in a vision that God gave to Daniel or that God gave to John, as we are looking at it a couple of thousand years later, sometimes it can be, or we may say, oh, I feel like I really get that. Or historically, I can say, oh, that makes sense. And we're going to see some of that today, where I feel like we can say with some measure of certainty, this is what that was talking about. This absolutely makes sense for this, all right? However, what we have to remember is that these are the things that are essential, and it is these things that are foundational. Everything else is a detail, isn't it? And everything else, whether I know all of those details or if I think I know what those details are, whether I'm right or wrong on those, does it really matter? It really doesn't. With respect to prophecy, we can, and hear me because there's real balance to this, I think that it is important to pay attention to what God has given to us in the prophetic sections of the Bible because it's part of His Word to us, and He intended for us to have all of it. There's some balance that needs to be had or maintained because I have known, and it's likely you have known, and maybe in your walk with the Lord there have been seasons of time where you were particularly just enthralled with prophecy, and you would go to workshops and there was conference. In fact, still today you'll see sometimes, not during COVID, but you'll see some churches that are maybe having some prophecy seminar that lasts an entire weekend. And so it's a Friday night, most of the day, Saturday and Sunday morning, noon and night. All this stuff that's prophecy. And growing up, I remember going to some of that stuff as a kid. And one of the things that I really liked is that when I would go to those things, the speakers, they tend to speak with, are there caveats to what they're saying, or are they speaking with a lot of certainty and clarity? They tend to speak with all sorts of certainty and clarity, and there's something else that they typically have a lot of. Have you noticed this? There's something they tend to bring a lot of. They tend to bring a lot of charts, don't they? And so let me pull this down. This happens, this happens, this happens. There's this. Here's a subset. Church goes out here, there, everywhere. And everything is very exacting and very specific. In the scheme of things, there is nothing wrong with trying to take what you believe that these symbols are saying or are communicating and say, hey, this is what I think. This is how I take this. This is how I understand this. And to give some thought to that and to spend some time digging and researching and trying to understand and try to put a big picture together. There's nothing wrong with that. However, what there is danger in is getting beyond any of these things and saying that those details and how you're interpreting some of this stuff, when you speak with absolute certainty about those things, then you can get into trouble. Because I really believe with all of my heart there are people, and I think they're well-intentioned. I think they have good motives, and they're sincere in their walk with the Lord. But I am confident that there are people that are walking around metaphorically with a whistle. And they are waiting for Jesus to come back and to do something out of order. And they're going to blow the whistle. And they're going to go, Jesus, this happens first. No, that is not how this is supposed to happen, because this bird with that feather riding this horse from that bowl, this is how it is supposed to happen. I had all of this figured out. And so let me just remind you the question that we talked about a moment ago. Why did God give us symbols? Part of it because there was a difficulty in communicating over time, but He also communicated in symbols because of this. If He wanted you to understand with clarity every detail, you know what He would have done? He'd have given you every detail. It is not in doubt, it is not subject to interpretation whether or not Jesus is the only way to heaven. There is no other name under heaven given among men whereby you must be saved. Why? Because the Bible says that one very clearly. The Bible does not say with respect to Jesus being the only way that there is a cave. And the path that leads to it is, there is gravel and there is hay over to the side, and there is a sunset glimmering over in the east. And you don't get that. You get very clear stuff because God wants me to know that very clearly. And let me just say, again, with respect to prophecy, you can think about it. You can say, hey, this is what I think, but you cannot go beyond these things and say, exactly, it has to happen this way. You have to give a caveat. You have to say, hey, this is how I think. And so to Donna's point with respect to the church being raptured and that it's going to happen before this, that's completely subject to interpretation. The Bible, let me say this, is emphatically not clear about that. It's just not. And you may say, well, I disagree. Well, you have your right to do that because at that point, we are talking about stuff that goes beyond the essentials and the foundations, because there are absolutely reasonable arguments that in some cases say, for example, with respect to the church, that they'll get some of this, but they won't get all of this. There are other positions that say they're going to get all of this before it gets to the bitter end of things getting really bad. And it can make an absolutely reasonable case for this. And these are people that have a real, meaningful walk with the Lord, that are using the Bible and what it actually says and these symbols and metaphors to lead them to those conclusions. That's perfect. So do you hear what I'm saying? That we need to give each other some space in the non-essentials, okay? And so know the big picture. Be certain of that. You can think about what goes on in between and come up with where you think you are. You can talk about that. We can discuss that. You can say, hey, these are the perspectives that are on the table, and you can say, this is what I think, and this is why I think that. And you may be right, but you know what? You also may be completely wrong. All I'm saying is take the whistle off, because at the end of the day, he's coming back. I don't know when. Because of that, I better be ready, and eventually he's going to make right everything that sin made wrong. I know that. All right? How's that for a 30-minute intro? Daniel 7 is where we're going to hang out. It's interesting. Thus far in the book of Daniel, things have gone chronologically. So there is the beginning of Daniel's story, and that he is part of the captives that have been carted off to where? So he's subject to the Babylonian Empire. There's this whole training process that he and some others have to go through, and he rises in the ranks. He gets this position of stature before the king of the empire, who is, remember who he was? No, the first one. It was Nebuchadnezzar. And so you've got that. You've got this progression within the Babylonian Empire, and you remember how Nebuchadnezzar loses. Remember, Daniel had the vision about Nebuchadnezzar. He loses his mind, is out for a period of 7 years, eating like an animal, grazing, hair growing out like mad, getting talons for fingernails. So you had all of that, and then we saw after Nebuchadnezzar, after we have the Babylonian Empire. What empire came next? You remember? The Medo-Persian Empire follows, and do you remember that guy's name? He was 62. He didn't take early retirement. He was waiting for the full check. Darius. So Darius comes on. In between Nebuchadnezzar, or after Nebuchadnezzar, before you get Darius, remember we were introduced to a king, or a leader whose name was still under the Babylonian regime, Belshazzar. In verse 1 of chapter 7, we're saying in the first year of King Belshazzar. Well, we actually saw that back in chapter 5. But some stuff has happened since 5, so we're kind of reverting back. And so essentially what you have going on is you have the story of Daniel's public ministry and life. But then after that, you get this series of visions that you have to go back and kind of tuck those in as to when Daniel received them. And so what we read in chapter 7, this vision that he got, this vision is received actually back in chapter 5. Okay, so before the Medes and Persians are in place, before Darius is the new leader, he has this vision. All right, so let's just walk through a little bit. In the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon, Daniel had a dream with a vision in his mind as he was lying in his bed. He wrote down the dream, and here is the summary of his account. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I was watching, and suddenly the four winds of heaven stirred up the great sea. 4 huge beasts came from the sea, each different from the other. All right, so we've got, all right, so there's our sea, and what do we have? Oh, so we've got 4 winds. And again, already, we're in word pictures now, aren't we? These are symbols. All right, so this stuff has to mean something. In fact, throughout Daniel's life and throughout our study already, we've seen Daniel has these visions where God is communicating through him. In fact, sometimes you had these kings that had these visions. They just don't know what they mean, and they need somebody like Daniel that God could speak to him what the vision actually means. And so in this dream, there's these winds that blow, and there's 4 of them. Do what? All right, so we got 4. Do you think there could be any symbolism to the 4 winds? What do you think would be about 4 winds? All right, Philip's back there. You got north, south, east, and west. So there's basically 4 directions. So there is these winds that are blowing, and if you have winds that converge from different directions, what does that create? It creates storms. It creates turbulence. So there is this turbulence that comes from the sea. Let me just go ahead and not just with respect to this, but everything that's going to follow in the weeks to come. I'm going to tell you what I think. I'm going to tell you where I land on some of this stuff. I'm going to tell you stuff that I feel pretty certain about this, and I'm going to say, with respect to some other stuff, this is the best guess. 50-50. Maybe right, maybe wrong. I don't know. And it may be something that you feel very clearly about. I'm just going to be honest. And so with respect to this, because of what we read down in verse 7, where it talks about coming from the earth, I believe that the sea here just is conveying the idea that it's earthly. Earthly as opposed to what? Heavenly or non-earthly. So from the earth, there are going to be, from every direction, this turbulence that produces what? But the text tells us that something comes out of this. Yeah, so we get beasts. All right, so we have, my beasts don't look very intimidating. So we have 4 beasts that come up from all of this. All right, so I want you to, even if you're not looking to study Bible, just kind of think through this. All right, so from the earth, from every direction, there is turbulence that's going to produce 4 beasts. What do you think those beasts might be? If something is a beast, is it big or small? It's big. Yeah, because sometimes we use the word beast to describe, I don't know, Thanksgiving's around the corner. You might go buy turkey and bring it home, and your family say, man, that's a beast, right? And so you're trying to say that it's big. So you have these 4 beasts that come, they're earthly. So what do you think these might represent? Empire. Yeah, thank you. I thought she said end times. She said empires or kingdoms. So these are empires or kingdoms. So Daniel's got this vision. He's trying to make sense. But what he's seeing out of the sea, there's all this turbulence. And doesn't that kind of make sense? Because with respect to the progression of history, where you have dominant world powers, they don't just kind of pop up, do they? What happens? They fight, don't they? There's turbulence. And so as these cultures, as these forces, as these powers collide, you have dominance that is raised up. And so you have 4 dominating kingdoms or empires. All right, starting in verse 4, they begin to get described. And so the first was like a lion, but had eagle's wings. I continued watching until its wings were torn off. It was lifted up from the ground, set on its feet like a man, and given a human mind. All right, so we've got so the beast number one is what? Is it a normal lion? No, it's not. It's not quite normal. A lion, but it had wings like an eagle. So that's kind of weird. So when you think about characteristics of a lion, what kind of stands out in your mind about a lion? They're really strong, aren't they? They're fierce. It's an apex predator, right? So it's at the top of the food chain. So if we're talking about a kingdom, we're going to say that this is a really powerful kingdom. And think about what it would be like if a lion could fly. What would that do to its killing capacity? Yes, I mean it has the ability. So you got a regular lion that's deadly, but you got a winged lion. Man, that's a fierce animal. Aren't you glad that lions can't fly? And I don't know if you've thought about this though too. I don't know. I regularly have random thoughts, which I'm sure you've noticed. But just think about, how it is that God placed animals in different parts of the earth. But think about if you're driving along. Oh man, we got to stop. There's an elephant crossing the road. What would you do? Or, thank goodness that Kodiak grizzly bears are in Alaska. What would you do if in your neighborhood you go walk out in your backyard, let your dog out, and there's a 1,800-pound bear in your backyard? So, anyway, that was a random thought. That's a symbol that says I'm crazy. Anyway, so you have this lion, powerful, but it's winged so that it even has greater danger or greater power and death capacity. But what happens? Wings get torn off. So it says it's like there's an injury of some sort. It gets handicapped in some form or fashion, and then winds up getting lifted from the ground, set back up on its feet like a man, and given a human mind. All right. If you had to guess kingdom, just based on that, I don't know if you were looking at a study Bible or not, but generally this is something that people feel pretty clearly. Historically, what are we talking about in terms of dominant world empire? The lion represents what? Yeah, that's the Babylonian Empire. And obviously he wasn't the only leader, but the dominant leader was who? It was Nebuchadnezzar. And what happened to Nebuchadnezzar? He went crazy. You might even say it was like a lion that had his wings pulled off. And for a period of 7 years is a crazy bird. But then what happens? He's raised back up and given a mind like a human mind. It says, I think symbolically, what God was trying to communicate to Daniel, hey, this is what's going to happen. Or this is what, at this point, this is what's happened. So you've had this, from the earth, this world power that has manifested itself. So you got a lion. Verse 5, suddenly another beast appeared, a second one, and this one looks like a what? And how it should go is you have lions. What should come next? Tigers. But no, we go straight to the bear now. And this one looked like a bear, except what? What does verse 5 tell us? It was raised up on one side, 3 ribs in its mouth, and it was gorging on flesh. Yes, so it's got 3 ribs in his mouth. So we're told there's 2 noticeable visual differences about this bear than a normal bear. So it's not all bears are going around with 3 ribs in its mouth. But what else does this one have? would you say this bear is symmetrical? What does it say? It's raised up on one side. So the bear is like this. All right? To me, that particular detail gives us a very strong hint as to what kingdom this represents. Yeah, so this is the Medo-Persian Empire. And it's interesting, we don't call it the Median Empire or the Mede Empire or the Persian Empire necessarily. We talk about it as the Medo-Persian Empire. So you have a combining of two that make one dominant kingdom or power. But was this a merger of equals? No, the Persian Empire was bigger. So if this is a bear and what is raised up on one side, doesn't that kind of fit nicely that the Persian Empire or that Persian aspect of this combined kingdom was bigger than this one? It's got 3 ribs in its mouth. So if you walk around, if you see a bear that's got ribs in its mouth, that says something about the danger of this animal, right? It says that it has been successful in some of its hunts, and it is. So if it's got 3 ribs in its mouth, it's possible that you might be able to guess what you think maybe one of those ribs is. Yeah, so one of the ribs almost logically of necessity would need to be Babylon, because they came on the scene because they beat them, right? There is another empire they took over. Well, it's not as prominent as certainly these, but Lydia, which is western part of Turkey. So if you can picture the Mediterranean Sea and then where Turkey kind of juts out, the western portion of Turkey. And then the other that the Medo-Persians conquered was Egypt. So there were 3 big kingdoms that the Medo-Persian Empire conquered: Babylon, Lydia, and Egypt. Strangely, this bear has 3 ribs in its mouth. I think it's a pretty safe bet to say, and there is widespread agreement, almost certain agreement, this bear represents, it's a symbol for the Medo-Persian Empire. All right, but the text continues, and it says, verse 6, "After this, while I was watching, suddenly another beast appeared. It was like a leopard with 4 wings of a bird on its back, had 4 heads, and it was given dominion." All right, so what color are we with? We're at blue. So what do we have now? We have a leopard. And so Donna said this is Greece. And there's general widespread agreement. It's the Grecian Empire that's being spoken of here. And so if you've got a leopard, what's the difference between a leopard and a lion? I mean, just in terms of how those animals operate. A lot faster. But this leopard also has what? Wings. Can you think back from history, like when you think of the Greek Empire, can you think of their dominant, like there is one leader that is associated with Greece? Alexander. And we don't just call him Alexander. We don't call him Alex. What do we call him? Alexander the Great, which that says something about your significance. And one of the things that was true about Alexander the Great in terms of how he led and how he led his armies is that they operated kind of like the Germans did in World War II. You remember the word blitzkrieg, which means lightning war? What does that mean? It's speaking of speed. It's talking about how fast you are. A leopard is a lot faster than a lion, but this isn't just a regular leopard. This is a winged leopard. That's a really, really dangerous animal. And Alexander the Great, with respect to the other kingdoms or provinces of the world, that made him particularly dangerous, and he was. After his death, and let's see, he checked out in, was it 323? Let me see if in 323, there's a leadership vacuum, and the generals do what with the Grecian Empire? They divide into how many provinces? They divide into 4. Now, what does this passage tell us? There was a leopard with 4 wings. It had how many heads? 4 of them. And so after Alexander the Great, the Greek Empire really does have 4 primary leaders. It is still a singular empire, but it has 4 heads of state. All right, so in verse 7, after this, while I was watching in the night vision, suddenly a 4th beast appeared, frightening and dreadful, incredibly strong, with large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed. It trampled with its feet whatever was left. It was different from all the beasts before, and it had 10 horns. All right, so in this one, we've had lion, bear, leopard. What's the last one that we have? It's just a beast. In fact, it's such a beast that Daniel doesn't really have an animal to characterize it with. Because you think about it, well, if you got lions and bears that are like, if you got something that's bigger than them, do you have what would you use? So I think Daniel's kind of out of words to use to describe what it was. But this thing was just massive. And what was particularly dangerous about this 4th beast? All right, so it had iron teeth. Now, some of y'all may know something about wooden teeth, right? But we've got, where's Nikki when I need her? Anyway, iron teeth. Man, what does that say? Really, really strong. So, because a regular human tooth, animal tooth, can break, but iron teeth, that is really strong. That's like a saw blade. So it had iron teeth, and it devoured and crushed and trampled. So if you're trampling something, what does that say about you and your size? I mean, and I don't know about you, but like in my mind, I've got like a King Kong type of thing, and not like running, but just stomping, and everything else comparatively is so small. And so Babylonian, Medo-Persian, Greek, what do we think this empire is? It's going to be Rome. Rome was different from all of these on a whole variety of levels, one of which it was absolutely massive. And comparatively, it dwarfs all of these others in terms of the scope of the territory and lands that they had conquered. And it just kept growing. In fact, in the end, that was part of the reason that brought about the fall of Rome, is that it was so massively big and unwieldy. And trying, at that point, with the absence of technology to manage all of that was so egregiously difficult. And so you've got Rome, that is this big fee-fi-fo-fum giant with iron teeth, and the Roman armies were just ruthlessly powerful and strong, and there was effectively no check to them almost until. But the other thing is, how long did the Roman Empire last? It was a few weeks. No, it lasts for a long time. Some of these others, you're looking at, in some cases, around a century, but you have, in one form or another, this hangs around for almost 1,000 years. That's massive, and nothing else is quite like that. All right, so it's crushing. It was different from the other beasts, and this one, let's go back to our beast. This is beast number 4. So I made now it looks more scary now, doesn't it? All right, so what's the deal with this beast that makes it different also? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 horns. We know about animals with 2 or 1. We don't know anything about 10. That's part of the other reason I think Daniel had difficulty. What do I liken this thing to? It's just so, it's so defying a parallel. Verse 8 says, while I was thinking about I'm trying to get my mind wrapped around these horns. Suddenly, another horn. So we got another horn. Well, what are we told about that horn? It was a little horn. Reminds me, Peter, our 4-year-old, because his older brothers had knives, he wanted a knife, and he'd gotten one from some, and like Kiara said, no, you can't have that. But he said, but it's a wood one. Anyway, so we have a little horn, but it's only little in the sense that it starts off small. Does it stay small? What does it do, according to verse 8? So this horn comes up, and what does it do? What does it do as it's coming up? In fact, it's a really big one. It's going to take out a total of 3 of them. It says they're uprooted. That conveys a different thought with respect, because this is going to make more sense as this unfolds, but these represent kingdoms as well. These horns come from the beast. And this beast represents what? It represents Rome. And so these are powers that come from, that emanate from Rome. And out of those powers that exist, 10 of them, there's going to be one that starts off really small, but it's going to, what's it going to do to 3 of the powers? If it uproots them, what happens to those powers? It doesn't mean that they just say, well, we'll just kind of, is there a merger? Is this a friendly acquisition? No, this is an overthrow, so that this one becomes the dominant one, such that all of these empires fall under this what had been the little horn. Let me. Isn't that beautiful? That really. Now it's clear, isn't it? You got it. And so. And suddenly, in this horn, what does this horn also have? This horn has it's got eyes and a mouth. All right. Verse 9, as I kept watching, I tell you what, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you the cliff notes of what I think's going on, and then next week we'll pick up and unpack a little bit of detail as to what we see, and then progress. So next week we'll back up just a hair to go back to some of this. But what I believe is going on, and by the time you get down to verse 15, where Daniel says, my spirit was troubled, these visions in my mind, they terrified me. I approached one of those who were standing by and asked him to clarify this. And at that point, Daniel starts to get some clarification as to what all this stands for. What I believe that you have going on, and the picture that is being described, is that emanating from effectively the old Roman Empire, they're going to rise up, whether it's actually 10 kingdoms or if 10 represents a term or a number of completeness, to say that there are these 10 dominating world, or excuse me, there is a completed number of dominant world powers. I don't know. I don't know if it means 10. And candidly, I remember as a kid, when these 10 horns were mentioned, I was told as a kid, without question, without equivocation, that those 10 represented what? It represented the European Union. And that made sense until what? Until they got more than 10 of them. So it was, there's 10 members of the EU. Well, there's 11. Well, scratch that. So it just goes back to what I said early on. You can say what you can think, and some of this stuff you can say, well, this possibly could be that. This kind of makes sense. But you have to say that, remember our essentials. Jesus is coming back. It's going to get worse before it gets better. And then he's going to make everything right that sin made wrong. That we know. Everything else, this is what I think. This, I believe, what do you think this little horn is? It's the Antichrist. And what do you think the eyes may represent? What can I do with my eyes? You can see. I think this says something about intelligence. And you think about this with respect to 2020, and because it's likely that you're familiar with what goes on with the progression of the book of Revelation, that we're not just talking about spiritual, ethereal concepts. We're going to talk about an actual person that is going to rise to world domination. An actual person exercising world domination that has these eyes that convey something about intelligence. I don't think it simply means, oh, this is a smart cookie, but I think there's another way that we use intelligence, don't we? Or that we use that word. How else do we use it? We talk about intelligence, somebody being smart, and we talk about if you talk, for example, about the intelligence agencies for the United States, who are you talking about? Talking about CIA, in part, well, at least domestically, the FBI, and NSA. In fact, there's a cabinet level position now. That happened after 9/11. There's a director of national intelligence, isn't it? And what are they doing? They are looking, and they are listening. I believe this, when we talk about if this does indeed, and I do believe it does represent the Antichrist, these eyes conveys the idea, the sense of the Antichrist and the power that this individual has of knowing what people are doing. And its mouth speaking arrogantly. I believe that the Antichrist is going to be a particularly gifted speaker. But one of the things that this is going to use that very effectively in helping to maintain or establish and maintain dominance as a leader and the leader of the world. I believe it's going to be a gifted speaker, but going to be an arrogant and prideful. Look at me, and I got to stop. Because if I got to keep y'all and tonight on the same page. So anyway, any questions about that? Does this so far make sense? You like that picture? I don't know if I can recreate that tonight. I mean, that's almost a masterpiece. Anyway, but to me, it's really neat, because prophecy. We talked about this at the beginning, that sometimes the prophecy had to do shorter term. In other ways, it had to do with long term. And with this, you have some short term and long term. And to me, it's really cool to look and say, well, this had 4 heads. Well, that's interesting. The Greek Empire wound up having 4 separate leaders. That really makes sense. That seems pretty clear. That's a lot of fun. So anyway, let me press the pause button, and we'll pick up next week. All right? God, thank you for giving us this time together, and I pray that you help us, especially going forward. We're walking through some passages that you have given us. We didn't write this. We didn't create this. You've given this to us, and it's important for us to be a good student of what you've given us, but help us to navigate this in ways where we stand strong on the stuff that we need to stand strong on, and then that you just might guide our thoughts, and that we might gain understanding that has an impact on us. But I pray at the very end of all of this and throughout this, we know, and it just underscores in our minds, that you are in control, and there is a plan that you are unfolding. And that plan is unfolding because you are God, and you are in charge, and you haven't abandoned us, and you haven't abandoned your position. And there are things that are going to happen, and because of that, we need and we must trust you. So that's our prayer, and we say it in Jesus' name. Amen.